And we're back. And now we are going to talk about the different roles that presidents are expected to fill. Obviously, this is a huge job, perhaps the biggest job in the world, and it's probably impossible to fill meet all these expectations entirely. But they are important, so let's talk about them. One is the president is essentially CEO of the United States. They lead the biggest corporation in the United States in terms of employment. There are more federal employees, like the federal government. The U.S. government is the biggest employer in the United States of America, possibly in the world. Not sure. India or China may have more employees, their governments. I'm not sure. But definitely in this country, the U.S. government is the biggest employer. All federal laws pass the president's desk. The president has a staff of about 1,000 people who work directly for them. This does not include cabinets and staff in each cabinet, cabinet and executive department. They deal with the bureaucracy, which can be slow to work, as you probably know. So this can slow response time as well. This is particularly noticeable when fast action is needed. So like Hurricane Katrina, 9/11, COVID, things like that. When there's an emergency, bureaucracy can slow it down. The pay is actually, I would argue, not that great. $400,000 a year is the salary the president makes. Plus, they have up to $50,000 in non-taxable expenses and about $100,000 for travel. $100,000 though, I mean, CEOs of medium-sized companies make way more than that. So, I mean, the pay is not super great. But then again, you probably don't run for president because for the paycheck. You probably do it because you want to make a difference, a positive difference, or you want power, or both of those things. All right. One area where the president really may have the most power, actually, would be the area of foreign policy. This is a power where presidential power is very expansive. Presidents generally are responsible for foreign policy for the United States. Congress has some role here, but not that much. I mean, they have the role in terms of the power of the purse. They have to fund stuff, but president is seen as sort of the leader of this. The founders, when they wrote the Constitution, wrote that pretty much gave the president pretty expansive powers here. Part of the reason they did that, probably, frankly, was because the foreign policy in 1787 was not nearly as expansive and big as it is now. Foreign policy in 1787 would have been Native Americans plus Britain, Spain, France, a few other European states. Today, it's much more expansive. And so as foreign policy has become more important, this has led to presidential power increasing as well. Now, president is not solely responsible here. Things like treaties must be ratified by a 2/3 vote of the Senate. But there is a workaround here, sort of, and that is executive agreements. Executive agreements don't need Senate approval. So the president can enter into an agreement with a foreign country just unilaterally without approval of the Senate or anyone else. The difference, though, between an executive agreement and a treaty is the treaty is considered force of law, which means that once a treaty is ratified, it is the law and it stays in effect until the Senate chooses to change it. An executive agreement doesn't have force of the law, which means that an executive agreement, president can withdraw from that anytime they want. So executive agreements are not as powerful or as lasting as treaties, but it is still a pretty powerful thing the president has. The president also has the authority to recognize or not recognize foreign governments. If there's some kind of controversy going on in a country, if the United States officially recognizes one faction as the legitimate government, that typically gives that faction a big hands up. So that is a power in terms of foreign policy the president really has. President is also chief legislator, and by that I mean all bills must pass the president's desk. President bill lands on the president's desk. Congress is the lawmaking body, but they do this in consultation with the president. A bill passes the House and the Senate. It arrives on the president's desk. President can sign it, becomes law. They can also veto it, and it does not. And then Congress can attempt to override. But overriding vetoes is pretty rare. I think in Trump's first term, there were only two vetoes that got overridden during his entire presidency. And I think there were 0 in Biden's. And those numbers are pretty accurate. It's probably looking at generally 0 to maybe 3 is kind of the normal number. So I say accurate, those numbers are pretty typical, I mean, is what I meant. So it happens, but not super often. It's fairly rare that vetoes get overridden. The president, of course, gives a State of the Union address, typically every year, though the Constitution simply says the president shall, from time to time, give information on the State of the Union. It doesn't say it should be every year. That's just become accepted. Also doesn't say it has to be a speech. George Washington and John Adams both gave speeches, but Jefferson, when he became president, didn't like giving speeches, so he just prepared a written statement and sent it to Congress, and every president from him until Wilson followed suit and did the same thing. Wilson, though, decided he wanted to give a speech, and so he started giving speeches again, and every president since then has followed suit. They've done this through speeches. No coincidence, I would say, that Wilson started giving speeches about the time radio became a thing. And then, of course, radio presidents began to recognize that if I give a speech, I can not so much speak to the Congress as I can speak directly to the American people. And typically it's politically to my advantage to do this. And so they've all done that since then. Of course, TV has made it even more advantageous. I don't really expect us to go back to written statements ever again. All right, some other powers presidents have: executive privilege. So this is not something that's written into the Constitution. This is perhaps implied by the fact that we have separation of powers. We have 3 branches of government that are independent of each other. And so executive privilege claims that the presidency, the executive branch, has the authority to withhold information from Congress and the courts under certain circumstances, because they argue Congress and courts may impede on their jurisdiction if they demand certain things from them. So they argue that executive privilege exists to protect the independency of the executive. Now, this is more theoretical than concrete because there is no, as I said, anything in the Constitution about this. And practice, it basically works if the courts let you get away with it. Sometimes courts will side with the president when they invoke executive privilege. Sometimes they will not. Usually this, like most court decisions, is based on precedent, but ultimately the courts get final say on this. Probably the most famous example of a president claiming executive privilege was Nixon during the Watergate affair. He claimed executive privilege to avoid turning over tapes which were recordings of Oval Office meetings. Ultimately, the courts didn't allow this to stand, and they ordered him to turn them over, and ultimately he did. Another power a president has is through the pocket veto. This is also something that's not explicitly in the Constitution, but the Constitution requires that if a bill lands on the president's desk, he has 10 days, excluding Sundays, to either sign the bill or veto the bill. Let's say, though, he does nothing. He neither signs it nor vetoes it. He takes no action. Under those circumstances, then the bill will become law after those 10 days pass by default. So it becomes a law without the president's signature. There is an exception to this rule, though. If Congress adjourns during that 10-day window, the bill does not become law, even if the president hasn't signed it. And since Congress has adjourned, they don't get a chance to try to override this veto. Thus, it is a an overriding proof veto. James Madison was the first president to utilize this in 1812. These are pretty rare, but it does happen sometimes. Typically, if Congress thinks there's a chance the president might veto a bill they pass, they will not adjourn within that 10-day window. But if they do, this could happen. President from 96 to 98 also had what was called the line item veto. What was this? Basically, it meant that when a bill lands on the president's desk, the president could go line through the bill and delete the parts they don't like, and then sign the bill, and what's left in the bill becomes law. The parts that were deleted do not. But this was taken away. The Supreme Court struck this down in 98. now. So now the president's choice is bill lands on their desk, they sign it, and the whole thing becomes law, or they veto it and nothing of it becomes law. So that's pretty much it when it comes to that. All right. So president also, in theory, serves as the popular leader, thus the leader of all Americans. Of course, many people will not agree with that or feel that way, but that is sort of the ideal here. Candidates can't win typically if they don't appeal to the center. So candidates tend to seem less partisan when they're running for office. I think this is historically true. I think this has probably changed some in recent years. Do we have unrealistic expectations of our president? I would say we generally do. We expect presidents and candidates, when they're running for president, tend to promise everything, and then when they get elected, they tend to not be able to deliver everything they promised. Which you might say, well, maybe they shouldn't promise everything, but reality is we tend to, as voters, reward candidates who promise everything. So if they want to get elected, they kind of have to do it. So ultimately, the point I'm making here is that yes, we have unrealistic expectations for our presidents, and this is why we oftentimes are disappointed by them, because we have unrealistic views of what they can actually do, and if they want to get elected, they kind of have to appeal to our unrealistic views. And that is all I'm going to talk about the roles of the presidency. Next, we're going to talk about about power presidency and how they've expanded over the last 200 plus years. So we will see you then. Adios.